Good evening, and welcome back to another episode of Ask an Ambassador with my counterparts, Kay Sunderum, way over there in California, and my good buddy Pat Brown off in Texas, the Lone Star State, where he just said everything is bigger and better, and I think he might be right. And in case we've got Kevin Cortez still buried deep in the hardened vault at the base of Mount Rushmore, keeping all the electrodes working and everything happening. Philip Johnson is not on with us tonight. He's inventorying the gift shop there at Mount Rushmore. As you know, they recently opened that. And if you can find it, I'm sure you can get a special deal on something or other. Tonight, we're going to talk about a topic that is actually recommended by a viewer. Zane Gard wrote us in at the very end of the last episode where we didn't have enough time to cover it. It said, do you have suggestions for using a home flight simulator to prepare for a flight interview? And we thought, what a great idea for a topic, didn't we?
Yes, we did.
So tonight we're going to talk about flight sims, flight training devices, advanced training devices, basic flight training devices. Basically, we're going to confuse you terribly. And right near the end, we're going to tie it all together in a neat little bow so it makes sense.
Are you sure?
Well, you know, it really is an interesting topic because it mixes terms. You know, there is the home flight simulator, computer-based thing that has become tremendously popular. People, right. Pilots and non-pilots use them. Right. But when we use the word sim or simulator, which we throw around a lot in aviation, we're almost guaranteed to be using it wrong, aren't we, Kay?
Yep, it depends on what your resources are, what you consider as a simulator, and how much money you can spend to purchase one or even to rent an item. So
and technically speaking, Pat, when we say simulator, we're generally talking about, if we're being accurate, and I mean FAA accurate, we're talking about that 2-story tall, hydraulically driven $1 million unit that the airlines use, not the thing that you're running on your PC at home.
Yeah, Microsoft or whatever those others are that you can buy for $100 or something like that, the video store, download or whatever. That's a video game. It's really a video game.
And good ones. They're entertaining, and they may even have a little bit of value, but it's not loggable. By the way, as always, and I neglected to mention this, as I do, maybe it should be a regular feature that I neglect to mention it. You can write in on any topic you want. We're going to be talking about flight training devices and even chair flying, which might be your best value ever. But if you've got a question about any aspect of aviation, go ahead and write it in. We might actually answer you. You know, I think my first exposure to what we call a sim, and actually isn't, was I had a neighbor as a kid, and I'm kid, 8th grade, 9th grade. His dad was an instrument flight instructor, and he actually had a Link trainer in his den. And I don't know if y'all remember the Link trainer, and I seem to remember it was blue and yellow, but it's like a little plywood cartoon airplane, and you climb in and they close this solid hood and it spins around. It's just an amazing thing. But they trained tens of thousands of military pilots in those, and that's not something you could use today. I mean, that's pretty much, that ship has sailed, wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, that was a pretty primitive thing, but for its day, it was, top of the line technology.
Yeah, and we've got an interesting comment here from Dread Metas saying, as a reminder, those multi-million-dollar simulators are also based mostly on the same code as those games, which there's some truth to that, but there is a complexity to those. You know, I've been over to JetBlue U here in Orlando, where they train most of the folks that work for JetBlue. And if you got knocked on the head and woke up in one of those Airbus sims, you'd believe you were at altitude in an Airbus. It looks like it. It sounds like it. Out the window looks like it. All the levers and dials and buttons, everything works. And that's when we're talking about simulator, not an aviation or an aircraft training device. But that simulator, and they are amazing. Have either of you ever had the experience of flying one of those?
I did. I worked for a major airline as an engineer, and I had the opportunity. We were working on cockpit redesign, and I had an opportunity to fly a Boeing 747. simulator
Ooh.
into San Francisco on an approach. Now, I won't tell you how that approach went the first time around, but I will say that it was so, realistic. And the part that I enjoyed the most is really, it's the chair flying. Even when that simulator was off and the instructor, had to leave, I was still able to sit there and really play around and get more comfortable with the cockpit panel, the part that we were trying to redesign. And so there's a lot of value, even if you don't have access to a multi-million-dollar device. Those games, I got to say that if as long as you're thinking aviation and you're going through the procedures, there's some benefit to that.
I got to fly a 747-200 sim down in Miami, but Pan Am's facility once, with a good friend from flight school who is now a captain for a major airline. And we took turns in the right seat, and the captain they'd put it on the skyhook and you'd shoot the approach. But we had never dealt with a flight director before, which is 4 times more sensitive than an ILS, which is more sensitive than a VOR. And the funniest one that happened was when I was actually observing and my friend was in the right seat, and he's shooting the approach in. He's just a dot or two off from being inside the donut. And the captain says, "Never seen anybody land one of these in the grass." And it didn't register with my friend, but you know what? It felt like you landed in the grass. It rumbles along. It's amazing. How about you, Pat?
Well, we've all had experience apparently flying a 747. My brother, let me set the stage a little bit. I had just come back into flying after a few years out. I was a quintessential rusty pilot, and my brother was an airline pilot who had moved into United's flight training department and was at the time the chief simulator engineer at United Airlines in Denver. So he was type rated in everything that they had. He had a flight instructor, type rated, ex-airline pilot, type rated in everything they had. And we went to visit him one time, and on the way in from Denver International, he says, "Hey, let's go by the office for a minute. I got to check on something." Unbeknownst to me, he'd booked us some time in a 747 full motion level D simulator. And we too took off from San Francisco, did a barrel roll over the Transamerica Tower, flew underneath the Golden Gate Bridge, and he set me up for a landing with a 20-knot crosswind, and he's calling out the radar altimeter altitudes as we're landing. He never touched the controls, and apparently we must have landed okay. And because he's a flight instructor, he could sign my logbook. So in my very, very first logbook, I've got all these entries for like Warrior 7, Warrior 152, 172, Warrior, Boeing 747, Warrior.
Well, and that's what's fascinating about those, because in reality, that is a simulator. That's a flight simulation device. You can actually get type rated in those, and it's very common today, which was totally unheard of in the old days. The first time an FO flies that airplane with passengers is the first time they've flown that airplane. Exactly. They've always, up to that point, been flying the simulator. Although it's probably worth pointing out, at the airlines, they do an excellent job of training, but I think what a lot of people aren't aware of, that you start out in your training in a classroom, and then you go to the paper trainer, which is literally posters. Kay, do you have a poster that's a particularly important?
I do. So you know what? This is something that I have used with several students in the past. This is a 182 with the G1000, and I recommend all pilots to have a photo of their cockpit, one that they fly the most often, whether it's your own personal or flight school or flying club. Take a picture and get that blown up and print it out, or buy something like this. This is like $10. You can put it on a board, or you could just pin it up on the wall. It's really, really cheap. But the airlines do this all the time, where you are, like you said, Jamie, you spend a ton of time on the ground and actually reviewing everything. So why shouldn't we GA pilot do that, especially when we're single pilot?
Well, it's such an inexpensive way to train, and it's part of why the airlines do it. But they go into that room, and as you say, Kay, you've got this poster. It's not just a piece of art. If you actually sit there and go through the takeoff and the climb out and the level off, and it's like, what frequency is this on? What color is that light? What position is this switch in? If you know all that, you're ready to move on to the next phase, which is a stationary training device, which looks like the cockpit, but it's just you're sitting in an office chair. And then the final step is the full motion sim. But we can mimic the early part of that by using those paper trainers, by doing chair flying, which I think we all do a little differently. But the great thing about chair flying is it's free. Now, Kay, you do chair flying differently than I do. How do you go about it?
So I encourage chair flying for all levels of pilots, and I'll share with you my own experience of doing real chair flying just a few months ago when I started spending a lot of time in a Cirrus SR-20, and I took, of course, the picture, but what's better is actually to sit in the airplane. And you know what, I put this aside here because I was hoping this topic was going to come up. So look how worn this is. This is a quick reference checklist for the SR-20. You can see how it's worn out. It should be. And I will sit here in the cockpit and go through it. And actually, my hands and legs are actually moving. So I'm actually mimicking everything at the same pace that I would do it if the engine was running or if we were actually flying. Both hands, we're always dialing things and we're pushing buttons, right? And so as you're going through, say, an abnormal or emergency procedure, you are actually going to that either primary flight display, multifunction display, go to the actual chapter and take your time and do it. And as you practice, you will get faster and faster. Plus that buttonology, you know, it's like a language, right? That buttonology comes to you only if you're sitting there doing it real time. And that has helped me tremendously. That shaved off a ton of time for my transition for my VFR checkout and IFR, because I'm coming from primarily a 172 into a Cirrus. There's a lot of differences. I'd never flown with a G1000 before. Autopilot's different. So to sit there in the cockpit and do that saved me a ton of time. That's
absolutely true. And I'm sorry, I'm tremendously distracted because I don't know if you noticed in the notes, my fan is here. Eric Pittman has come in. Eric, hi, thank you. Eric's in Columbia, South Carolina, and works for Publix. I was hoping to stop in to see him actually tomorrow because I'm heading in the mighty 152 from Central Florida up to Maryland, but I'm going to end up taking a more inland route because of weather concerns. I don't want to be stuck on the beach, only being able to move east when the next piece of land to the east is 3,000 miles away.
Not a good choice. Good aeronautical decision making there, Jamie.
Thank you very much, Pat. I've been working on it. But, you know, Kay's point about chair flying, and I tend not to do it in the airplane, although that's the better choice. I tend to do it at home because I've got stuff to do at the house. But even when I was getting my seaplane rating in a J3 Cub, the simplest airplane in the world to fly, I would sit in the chair and I would go through idle taxi. Where's the stick? Where's my left hand? Are the water rudders up or down? And I run through the whole thing and I get into the step taxi and I get into the rough water takeoff or landing. You go through the whole process just sitting in a chair. And I've often told students, if you feel goofy about it, just shut the bedroom door or whatever. But I don't think there is a better bang for the buck in a training environment than just by yourself with that book you have, Kay, running through it, because you really get what's VX, what's VY, what's VFE, everything starts coming together because you're getting that, you know, we were talking before, Pat, muscle memory, where you've got everything right in place and you're used to moving your hand to the throttle or to the stick or whatever. How do you do it, Pat? Or do you dispense with it? Because in Texas, it's just not necessary.
Everything is better, right? Yeah. No, honestly, I will tell you, I haven't done it in a while, and part of the reason is because I fly on a routine basis, probably 500 to 600 hours a year. So, in my personal airplane, I've got, I don't know, a couple of thousand hours in my personal airplane. So I pretty much can touch everything just by closing my eyes. But having said that, like you, Jamie, when I got my seaplane rating, and like you, Kay, the first time I got that airplane, I did find it easy. I found it helpful to sit in the cockpit and actually close my eyes and try to visualize where is this thing, and then reach out and and touch it. When I was working on my instrument rating back when the Wright brothers were still alive, I found that I did sit in a chair, and I pretended that I had my hands on the yoke, and I would close my eyes, and I would picture. This is the days before GPS, so I'd picture dialing in a localizer or flying a procedure chart on a VOR approach or an NDB approach. Some of our listeners might think, what strange manner of thing is an NDB approach? Well, that was a fun one. But
NDB holds. Ooh.
Yeah, and to be quite as honest with you, I found that whole chair flying or mental flying, however you want to call it, to be tremendously helpful with the kind of stuff that requires spatial situational awareness. More so for me, more so than figuring out where all the things are and the buttons that I got and the knobs. For me, I'm situational awareness is not one of my strengths. So that kind of spatial reasoning stuff is not a real strong point of mine. So for me, just closing my eyes and just imagining hitting the fix and turning to a heading and what's the tail end of the needle going to do in the case of an NDB approach, or do I need a to or from indication of the VOR, and am I going to re-intercept the radial before I start my procedure turn? Those kind of things for me are necessary mental exercise, and sitting in the airplane is fine. Sitting in a comfy chair is fine. Sitting at your desk is fine. It doesn't really matter where you do it, but you got to be able to do it in an environment that's quiet and where there's no distractions.
And one of the things you mentioned is something that we don't even think about touching those throttle, mixture, prop, and all that sort of thing. I was so dumb when I started flight training. I thought that the designers of aircraft had not realized that they were making everything different shapes and sizes and colors because they were lazy and hadn't standardized. It took me a while to realize that the throttle and the mixture and the prop are different colors, different shapes. The flap handle looks like a flap. The gear extension handle looks like a wheel. Because we take our sight for granted, but the reality is that chair flying can be very helpful, because it could be you lose your electrical system at night. It could be you get something in your eye and you can't see well, or there's smoke in the cockpit. And there's just things we don't foresee. But the reality is those chair flying experiences, those at-home simulation experiences, can give you a huge benefit when something bad happens and you realize, I can find those switches and I know what I'm touching, even if I can't see it. So
a good litmus test is, do you know where all those buttons are without actually looking at it? You should be able to find it. And on one item that I think a lot of us forget about are the circuit breakers. Mm-hmm. And there are some places, like in the Cirrus, it's down here near your thigh, or excuse me, near your shin, at least for me. And my seat is up so close that I can't actually see them. I kind of have to know where they are, because if I pull my seat back, then I can't reach the rudder pedals anymore. That's not good.
I had a Cirrus person who's like you. I have a Cirrus, and tell me, why don't you take a picture? I mean, with a camera, take a picture of the circuit breaker panel down there, print it out, and stick it in the console in the middle. And I'll tell you what, boy, that'll save you some grief if something goes wrong.
As a former Piper Cub owner, I'm wondering what you're talking about, these circuit things. What is that? Dread Menace is back, making an excellent point that the user interface in planes can be very hectic. There's an awful lot there. And we've gone from, Pat, you were talking about the NDB days when we started, and we did have to do NDB approaches, NDB holds, things like that. And by the way, if you've never used an NDB, are you a lucky individual? But yeah, I mean, now we're up to the G1000s and all the glass panels and everything. Tremendous amount of information available to us, but you have to know how to use it. Because if you don't know how that user interface works, to your point, Kay, if you don't know which button does what, you don't really have the time to be head down punching buttons trying to find the right menu or whatever. and I especially make this point with students, primary students, let's assume all this is broken. Everything that can hurt us is out the window. So let's look out the window and learn how to fly this by ear. What's the throttle doing? I can tell my altitude more or less. All of that can be learned in that home environment, chair flying. Now, is it an upgrade if we do what Zane was talking about and use like Microsoft Flight Simulator or one of those tools? Do you think that enhances or detracts from a chair flying experience? And I'm going to you, Pat, first. Then we'll go to Engineer K, who designed a 747 cockpit.
I don't know. Having never really been enthralled with the idea of a video game that simulates an airplane because I can actually go fly a real airplane. I honestly, they just never appeal to me in any way, shape, or form. So, I mean, I've played with them a little bit from time to time. Most of the time, I crash them. So I don't know. I can't offer anything on that one.
Well, Kay, you're a big advocate. We all are big advocates of chair flying. Do you think that chair flying requires the addition of that desktop-based flight simulator, or do you think you can do as good or better a job just doing the chair flying?
You know what? It depends on what you're focusing on. So if you are trying to improve your systems knowledge, for example, or the cockpit itself, what do I have in my cockpit? What are all the items and the automation piece, for example? We haven't even touched on that yet. Mm-hmm. If that's where you're trying to make the improvement, then I say sit in the cockpit and go through the procedures. Take a APU, auxiliary power unit, connect it to the airplane, turn on everything without the hobs running, all right, and take your time and go through everything. But if it is actually, say, flying an instrument procedure, then hands down, one of the whether it's Microsoft Flight Simulator or whatever the tool is, I think that's a great way. Now, I don't care so much about how that airplane flies while you're sitting in, whether you have a mock device connected and how it feels. However, the procedure, you're going to learn a lot. If you have your chart, whether it's a paper chart or if you're using an electronic flight bag and you have your iPad, for example, next to you and you're connected to a flight simulator, you'll really learn, well, how do I shoot that approach? I mean, did I just bust through the glide slope? Am I on course laterally? You'll learn a lot of that by connecting to one of those tools. So it really depends on what you're trying to focus on: systems knowledge, the airplane knowledge, or the procedures.
Here's where a simulator, and again, I'm using kind of an overarching term here because we haven't gotten into it, but there's basically four types of simulators, two of them that really are the ones that we in little airplanes typically use. But here's in my opinion, what a simulator is good for. That G1000, for example, has 64 buttons. It has, last I remember, it has 12 knobs. It has 18 knobs. 12 of those have an inner and outer knob, and 6 or so of them have buttons on the inner knob. There's a lot of stuff going on. Now, ask me how I know that is because I actually counted them to make a point during a safety seminar one time. And then, Kay, I don't know I think you have the perspective, which has the FMS. There's another 60 buttons there and another several knobs with inner and outer buttons and push buttons on top of that. So where a simulator really does come in handy, if you don't have the luxury of being able to plug in an APU and do it in an airplane, is get into one of these simulators, either a basic aviation training device, a BATD, or an advanced aviation training device, an AATD. Those are the two types that typically we'll deal with. And with hopes that they have an overlay on the screen that will simulate something like the G1000 or any of the other, the Avidyne products, really any of the other that are out there, and get used to that button pushing there in the simulator. That, in my opinion, that's where a simulator really has some value. And then the procedural stuff, like you said, Kay, invaluable in just reinforcing the muscle memory and the buttonology and just where your hands go.
I did that exact. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Kay.
Just to add to what Pat was saying about the buttonology piece, you can go to the manufacturer of that system. And for example, for Garmin, we've been talking about the G1000. You can go to their website, and if you're using, say, the GTN 650, they have a training device. It's free.
Yep.
You can go onto their website, and it just brings that up on your device, and you can go ahead. You have to use your your mouse to go ahead and pretend like you're turning the button knob or something like that. It's not a touchscreen on the trainer, but that's a great way to learn all of those buttons too. And they have one for various devices, and all the manufacturers do.
Yeah,
I've actually used that.
Those, like the 650, for example, the 750, you don't download it on your iPad, and the touchscreen does work.
Oh, okay, great.
Yeah, I've actually written educational courses how to use devices based on those, because they are very accurate. And you were talking about all the buttons and knobs and things on the G1000, Pat. I did exactly what you're talking about, because I come from the days of round dials and little needles and everything being analog, and I'm comfortable in that environment. When I decided it was time to start getting a little awareness of the G1000 or the glass, I actually went to a flight school that had a static training device that was G1000. And the advantage to me is, one is cost. It doesn't cost what the airplane costs. Right. And I can sit there and everything works just like I'm in the airplane, but it doesn't have that cost. And the other thing is, if I start getting overloaded, believe it or not, that happens. I'm not that smart. If I start getting overloaded, we can pause. Okay, which button did I mean to hit here? What did I accidentally do? And really, that's helpful, because very often, especially early in flight training, whether it's VFR or IFR, that you become overloaded at some point. You become task saturated, and you're not learning anymore. You're just trying to keep up. And the person in the right seat's talking to you, telling you to try things, and there's somebody on the radio telling you to do something. And I think I heard my N number, and I'm off my altitude. And you're no longer learning anything, but you are spending a large amount of money.
Yeah.
So that's where we get into, as you were saying, the aviation training devices, advanced or basic. And those do have real value. But I think sometimes people misunderstand what can you log and what's beneficial. Do you want to speak to that at all, Pat, in even the most general terms?
Well, yes, you can log time in a basic or an advanced trainer. It has to be dual. It has to be logged in the simulated or flight sim or simulated instrument column. It can't be logged as flight time. As I said, it has to be dual. That trainer has to be approved by the FAA. There has to be a letter of authorization as a part of that approval, which tells the operator and the renter what those simulators can be used for. Some time can be applied to your flight training. It's interesting, for example, that your private pilot certificate, for example, requires 3 hours of hood time. You can accomplish 3 hours of instrument training. Well, actually, with a view limiting device, but you can accomplish 3 hours or more of training in a flight training device, in an aviation training device, different than a flight training device, and log that in the simulated column as dual instruction. However, in order to comply with the FARs for private pilot, that 3 hours still has to be in the airplane. So even though you can log 3 hours or 100 hours for that matter, a flight training under simulated instrument conditions in a simulator, you may not be able to count all of those hours towards your training, whatever you may be training for. For example, you can count up to 10 hours in a basic training device, or 20 hours in an advanced training device. But again, the FAA has to approve, and this is towards the instrument rating, has to approve it, and it's got to be dual instruction. You can get more if you're in a full flight simulator, but again, that's the kind of stuff that you're going to find in the airline world,
right?
Not nothing that we can afford. So
Well,
the answer is it kind of depends on what you can log and how much of it you can log. And the FARs, they control that. You can never log more in the simulator than the FARs allow you to.
and I appreciate that, Pat. And David Vedder's written in with a pretty interesting comment. First of all, he likes the topic, and I like it when viewers like the topic. I think we can all agree on that. But he's asking, do we have a preference where X-Plane or Microsoft Flight Simulator? I've used them both, and we talked about this earlier. They both have value, but you can't log it. But it's kind of an enhancement to the chair flying we would do, either sitting in an actual cockpit or in our office chairs, as we are right now. It's personal preference. If you like it, use it. If you don't like it, you can still get the same benefit without having that. Now, I will say, I'm very encouraged from the educational standpoint, and a lot of colleges are starting to do this from what I see. They begin to introduce concepts in a simulator or a training device to teach what's rotation, what's VX, what's VY, and blah, blah, blah. And then we go out and practice that in the airplane. And I actually think that's a good use of a flight training device where you can introduce a topic where the student is not under a lot of stress. They don't have this self-imposed workload. They don't have all the distractions. And let's face it, early in flight training, everything that's not right here is a distraction. But, in that sense, I think those are valuable. And I don't mean to run down Microsoft Flight Simulator or the X-Plane or any of the others. I'm not trying to dump on them, but the value in this is really, to my mind, the instructor doing their job and the student being very focused on, we're pretending this is a specific airplane doing a specific thing. And we run, it's dress rehearsal from plays. And Kay, I think that's kind of what you're talking about when you're in a cockpit with
Right.
the 10 million buttons and knobs and things, but you're actually in the airplane. You know how far the reach is. You know what that feels like. You know where it's located. You know, oh, I need 3 hands to do this, so maybe I need somebody else in the right seat for this flight.
There's a lot of visualization. That's a word that I want people to remember. You have to visualize. It's really important. And as we're learning maneuvers, whether we're a private pilot, instrument, commercial, we're ATP, we got 100,000 hours and we're just going back for a flight review, we still have to practice, right? A good pilot is always learning, and we never get to the point where we've learned it all and we don't have to do anymore. And so no matter what your experience level is, you got to go back and practice. And one of the best ways to do that is to really visualize and go at the same pace that you would do it in flight. And Jamie, to add on to your comment about the tools that you can use, whether it's Microsoft Simulator or X-Plane or whatever it is, you want to supplement that with some of the online educational tools too. We've come a long way with how information is presented, and I love the fact that now, as a flight instructor, you can tell a student, hey, watch this online on your iPad or at home, and we're going to do this maneuver the next time. And they get to watch that. And then if they can watch it first, and there's a lot of simulation in these learning management systems are amazing now. And they also usually, a lot of the companies will add on footage, using a GoPro camera or something like that. And they'll show you what the maneuver should look like from the inside, from the outside, from all different angles. And they'll show you what the standards are that you need to meet. And so you've watched it. And then if you can go and practice in a simulator or one of the games, that's great. Then the third item is when you get back to the airport. And now you have all this knowledge on what the expectations are, what the standards are, and you've had an opportunity to really visualize the maneuver. And that is going to take you so much further in that lesson and make it a lot more cost effective.
That's an excellent point. And let's back up to something Pat mentioned a little while ago, paperwork, the letter of authorization. You can't just, I know any of us as a CFI can't just run out and buy some desktop unit and plunk it in a room and say, we have a simulator, we'll charge people $25 an hour for it. Maybe it's a good idea, Pat, if I'm a flight student at any level, primary, instrument, commercial, whatever, and I'm interested in using flight training devices to lower my cost and enhance my learning, Maybe that's a good topic to discuss when I go into the flight school and say, do you use flight training devices, aviation training devices, and how do you use them, and what's loggable of that, and what's the benefit to me? Maybe that's another thing to talk about besides what type of aircraft do you fly, do you do structured ground school, that sort of thing. Would you agree, sir?
Yeah, no, I agree with you there. You know, the thing is that oftentimes when a particular private pilot candidate walks into a flight school, that person, he or she, they don't know what they don't know. And
I didn't, that's for sure.
Yeah, and you know, I try to put myself back in my shoes when I was 16 years old, like I said, back when the Wright brothers were still alive. And when I first walked into, drove my covered wagon to the airport to get my flight training, I didn't know what to ask for. So I think it's unrealistic to expect them to know to walk in and ask about a flight training device. Now, if you're an instrument pilot, instrument student, probably so. But either way, your point is well taken. If there's a simulator available in the school and they have the presence of mind to ask, or if there's any flight school people listening tonight, and you're not telling your potential students about the value of some sort of an aviation training device, then they shouldn't be. Does that answer your question, Jamie? I was just rattling on until I ran out.
No, that was excellent. It was good. And I have a question that comes to mind. I was a little distracted because Martin Kastenbaum wrote in and said, "Hey, Pat."
Yeah, I just saw that. Hey, Martin, how you doing, buddy?
But I was about to text Martin specially, not that I have his number, and say, your covered wagon, did that have spinners on it, or was that the original model?
It was the original model. 4 horsepower.
Had to ask. Well, this is an interesting thing because truthfully, Zane's question, was about how I use a flight sim, a desktop flight sim, to prepare for my flight review. And frankly, I wouldn't use one to prepare for a flight review. I would just do the chair flying in my office, or go sit in the airplane if I have one available.
Right.
But this does open up an entirely new topic. There's a set of tools out there, the training devices, flight sims, that are available, but both the school and the student or the customer have to know how it's going to be used effectively. Much like, I can jump into the Cirrus with the G1000 and everything's fantastic, but if I don't know how the G1000 works, no other part of that airplane is helpful to me. I can't get it out of the parking spot. So what do you think would be a good way, for somebody who is brand new, who just is overwhelmed with ignorance, as we all were at one time? How do they think about talking to somebody about how could I use these training devices in flight school to lower my cost or enhance my educational value so I really get a good bang for the buck? How would you start that conversation?
You just ask that flight instructor, hey, what are the tools that I can use? And a good flight instructor is not going to tell you, well, you just got to meet with me and we'll just go flying. It's not about just flight time. There's a lot of groundwork that needs to be done. And a good instructor will say, well, I'll always prep you ahead of time so that you know what we're going to do at the next lesson. I'll give you I'll tell you about the lesson plan and what we're going to be working on, so you can spend time on the homework, watching, whatever the videos are. Hopefully there is some sort of learning management system. It might be something from Sporty's Pilot Shop. It might be something from Blind. It might be King Schools. There's a ton of them, and they're all really, really good. And so whatever your instructor is, advising you to use, then you do that homework, but then ask your instructor if he or she doesn't, mention anything about simulators or training devices. Just ask them, hey, is this something that we can incorporate into the training? And if you're not aware of it, is there even any availability at the field? Maybe there's another company that has it. And it is not uncommon for flying clubs and flight schools to go to a different entity just for that simulator. Because not everybody has it. So you just simply have to ask. Not
bad. By the way, Zane Gard has written in to say hi. And this, Zane, you spun this entire topic with the question you asked last time around. So thank you very much. Please let us know if we're in any way answering your question or if we're just babbling for an hour. Pat, I cut you off.
Yes, you did, and that was very rude of you. But I love you like a brother, so I'll let it go this time.
Thank you.
There's so much rattling around, and I have to get it out. There's flight sims are fine, they are, but they have to be used effectively. And just because you spend a lot of time in I'll use the proper term, an aviation training device, doesn't necessarily mean that information is going to transfer positively to the airplane. Mm-hmm. For instrument training, for example, for procedural stuff, here's where the missed approach is, the throttle goes in, we pitch up, that kind of stuff. We're joining the final approach course, we're hitting the initial fix, whatever that might be. Whoops, the crosswind was so strong, we'll reset it, we'll go back and do it again. That kind of stuff, I think is pretty good. To try to teach somebody how to do S-turns across the road, which might not be a great example, but or steep turns or stalls or something like that, I'm just not convinced that that's the best way to go about it. Now, I have to, the caveat there is that I'm a dinosaur. I know it. None of us grew up in the age of readily available simulators like they are today. None of us did. None of us, Kay is the youngest. She's the baby. She was just born when I was already 60 years old.
I hate to admit this, but when I was young, television was still black and white.
Yeah. Something, the first color television that we had a remote, but it was connected to the TV with about a 30-foot cord. Before that, the remote was my dad saying, "Hey, Pat, go change the channel."
I'm not making any comments about my age or my weight. Okay, continue on, Pat.
Well, the point is that it really, to be a little bit more serious for just a second, none of us grew up in an age where simulators were ubiquitous. They just didn't exist in a form that any of us could afford. So I'm coming at it realizing that, in a sense, I'm a bit prejudiced against simulators. You don't get the tactile feel in the kind of simulators, aviation training devices that we can afford. You typically don't get the tactile feel that you get in an airplane. So you can roll into a steep turn, for example, but if you don't get the sense that the nose is dropping and there's airspeed picking up and the wind noise around the airplane cockpit is increasing, and the G-force is as little as they may be when you pull back on the yoke to keep the nose from dropping, I'm not sure that that's going to be a positive transfer of learning into the cockpit, beyond the fact that the picture outside the cockpit in the left-hand turn is different than the picture outside the cockpit in a right-hand turn if you're in a side-by-side seating situation. Mm-hmm. So it's the tactile feel or lack thereof in aviation training devices that we have access to that makes me not a big fan. There was a well-known sim manufacturer here in the States, I won't mention the name, that tried what I thought was a very noble experiment a few years ago. And the idea was to use flight simulators for virtually, and I'm talking about basic aviation training devices, and actually a combination of basic and advanced aviation training devices, with the idea of being able to cut down the amount of time that was needed in the airplane, thereby reducing the overall cost of the experience. It didn't work. I suspect that there was a variety of reasons for that, and I'm not going to try to go in and analyze all of them. We don't have the time. We only have 10 minutes left. But it didn't work. And that just, to me, is, and it's only one data point. I grant you it's only one data point, but it's an indication to me that, here's a company that had a vested interest in making it work, and it didn't. Mm-hmm. And So anyway, I could go
No,
on.
those are good points. And by the way, Martin came back and he had an interesting comment. And I think he used a flight training device really intelligently. 20 hours of his instrument training was done in a training device, which helps keep his costs down. And it can be a good learning environment. He still uses it for proficiency. And that can be beneficial. If I don't have access to an airplane and I want to keep doing my approaches and holds and things, that can be great. But let me segue into an entirely different topic. This is really all about understanding and being able to perform and learning information. You know, we talked about the ignorance factor, which every pilot suffers from. We all know something that the others don't, and everybody else knows something we don't. And it's always going to be that way. But we can use videos, which, you know, another technological advance is whether it's YouTube or any of the other providers. There is an enormous amount of high quality educational material that can help you not perform the maneuver, but understand why it's done that way. And understanding is a huge part, you know, that whole role, understanding, application, correlation. We want to climb that educational ladder.
Right.
So whether it's John and Martha King doing their thing, or Jason Schapper just did a nice thing on how to improve your landings and correct for errors, or maybe the best think piece I've seen on aeronautical efforts is the ASI video. Aviation Safety Institute just did a great one on the impossible turn.
Yes.
Which people have talked
great
for years about that, and they really made it clear. It depends on the pilot's proficiency, the weather conditions, the type of aircraft, the terrain. There are a zillion variables. So don't and you can learn that from watching that video. This is not a one-size-fits-all deal. You know, you're going to have to think about this. Am I flying a TBM or a Cub? Am I in a 172 or a Bonanza? Totally different outcome. So that kind of thing, those videos can be really valuable. And of course, that's why we often tout the Aviation Safety Institute. There's some really talented folks there that make great videos, but really smart people who know what they're talking about. And I learned from them, and I've been doing this for 30 years. I suspect somebody who's new to the industry could watch some of those videos and go, oh, now I get it. You actually reconfigure the airplane for a short takeoff. I see.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a question here about virtual reality. What about VR?
I believe I am a virtual reality.
You're talking head for sure.
No, it's a coming thing, you know, and we can all, everybody has had the experience of seeing a new piece of technology pop up and say, well, that's not going to work. But the reality is, through our entire lives, you know, joking, really, television was black and white when I was a kid. Then it became color. Then it became high def. I mean, we had AM radio, then we had FM radio, then we had MP3s and streaming. I mean, technology comes along and it has crept into the cockpit as well. It's not a joke. I mean, when you're talking about circuit breakers, Kay, and literally I've owned 2 airplanes that didn't have circuit breakers because there was no system.
Yeah.
But that's an advance, and it's just something that we all get into over time. That technology comes along, and I have no doubt VR is going to be one of those. Virtual reality will become a real training thing, especially as drones take over from manned aircraft a few decades from now. They'll be flying with VR. And I'm off my soapbox, but I'm just saying, I think it's a real thing.
Well, you know, in addition, there's also automation. We've come a long way with the automation in general aviation, and but you got to know how to use it, and you have to know when to turn it off. And it's great to help you reduce your workload, but it can be a detriment if it goes stray and you don't realize that, or you don't know how to how to disconnect it, for example. And so just learning how to use the automation is a big thing now. That I didn't have to worry about that in the beginning of my training.
Yeah, everything was manual. Christopher Ritchie has a great question. I really like this. What makes the sims at flight schools loggable versus the one you put together at home non-loggable? Pat, I'll let you take this if you want, but there is a difference between the training device at the flight school where you can log time and the flight simulator on your computer at home where you can't.
Right. Well, I'm going to assume that Christopher might have come in a little bit late. The two basic types of simulators that most of us can afford to really buy or more likely rent time in would be a basic aviation training device, a BATD, or an advanced aviation training device, an AATD, neither of which is a Microsoft Flight Simulator or one of its competitors.
Mhm.
And in order for the time to be loggable, number one, it has to be dual. So just sitting by yourself at your desk at the house doesn't count. And number two, there has to be a letter of authorization in the possession of the flight school or whoever is using the aviation training device for flight training. So you can log an unlimited number of hours in your logbook in the simulated instrument or flight training device column, but only a certain number of those hours are going to count towards your flight training. And you have to look at the letter of authorization and also the FARs that pertain to the specific certificate or rating that you are working towards to figure out how many hours can be counted towards that certificate or that rating. And even if you can log some of those hours in pursuit of that certificate or rating, some of those hours may have to be repeated in an airplane. And the LOA will tell you all of that.
And I think this is not a blanket rule, but just a thumbnail rule. And I mean this in all seriousness. If you're looking at a flight training device that you think you want to use at home, and you'll have your friend, the CFI, come over and you'll be able to log it. If the price doesn't start with 4 digits, it's not a loggable device.
That's about right.
And when you log the time, make sure you distinguish between, well, is it an aviation, training device, or is it a basic or an advanced, and some of those logbooks don't have that column. It'll just say simulator or training device. And so I would handwrite in one of those blank columns what you're actually using. That's good for record keeping. Yeah. And when you do submit a 8710, Airman's certification rating application, there they do distinguish the different types of simulators. But that's the only place where I haven't seen logbooks have that distinguishment. So you'll have to handwrite that in. So something to keep note of. Yeah,
you make a good point, Kate. You have to specify in your logbook what type of aviation training device you're using. And interestingly enough, another thing that has to be in play when you're using one of these BATDs or AATDs is that they have to have the equipment in there per 91.205. So you learn tomato flames and grab card and all of those other crazy acronyms. They have to have all that stuff in the airplane, and it has to work.
Yeah, I was about to mention that it's one of the things to think about. It can't be a generic flight sim that has a picture of an airplane that looks very realistic. It has to actually emulate the controls and performance of a specific type of airplane.
Right.
So you're using this advanced aviation training device, but it's emulating a B-36 or a C-172 or whatever.
Yeah.
Well, this has been enlightening. I certainly learned things, as I always do, because both our viewers are very smart. And thank you, John Regan, for noticing the 57 telly. But I learned stuff from Kay and Pat every time because I don't think it's a big secret. They're smarter than me. And that's just the way it is. Before we go, I want to point out that we are going to be doing a special Ask an Ambassador during AirVenture, and we're going to be doing it entirely with questions from you, just like we did this time with Zane Gard. Thank you, Zane, for a great question that gave us an hour-long episode. So please write to us at ambassadors@aopa.org. Just whatever your question is, any topic at all, just let us know. We'll dive into it, and if I have no idea, I'll throw it to one of them, and they'll take care of it for me. Hey, we really do appreciate this. We'll be back next time on Tuesday, June 22nd, 4 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Central, Pat, and 7 Eastern. We're all in a different time zone. It's very confusing. Yeah. But Pat, you got any closing comments for us that will just enrich the souls of the viewers who are on with us, as well as the people who watch this on replay later?
Well, this random thought just happened to pop into my head with regard to AOPA's flight training survey. I don't know what made it pop into my head, but it did just randomly.
And what was that called?
The AOPA's flight training survey.
Interesting. I think I've heard of that.
Yeah, this is something we've been doing for quite some time. You can see it there on the screen. If you are a student pilot, or even if you're an active or inactive certificated pilot, and you have some thoughts that you want to share with us on your favorite flight instructor or a flight school that you think is doing a particularly good job, we really do want to hear about it. We do this every year. We took a pause last year because of COVID, but we're right back in the thick of it now. And this is a survey that allows people to recognize really exceptional flight schools, exceptional flight instructors in the field, and they're recognized nationally with some nice awards. And I think we do that. We do that in May every year. I think the flight training survey happens in the summertime through the fall, and then we do it sometime. Frankly, I don't remember when we do it, but we do it. So
it is open now, and I must admit, it's not just cheering. If you have an experience that's negative somehow, report that as well, because we do have folks on staff at You Can Fly who really make an effort to provide the tools that make flight schools better, that make CFIs better. And if we have a good understanding of where somebody's falling down, or maybe it's not even wrong, it's just somebody can reach out to you and say, yeah, that's normal. So yeah, participate, AOPA.org/FT survey.
Doesn't take that long either.
No,
doesn't take very long too, and it's really valuable.
What's it cost, Kay?
It's free.
Oh, my favorite price. I like that. Just like chair flying. It's free. Just like chair flying. It's perfect. And Kay, do you have any closing thoughts that you would like to share, since Pat kind of hogged the show with the whole flight training survey thing? You have something that you'd like to
I would say be safe, keep flying, and keep chair flying.
Ooh, I like that a lot. I've got to admit, this entire topic with the flight simulators and advanced training devices, basic training devices, I really do like chair flying best. It's right here in my house. I can do it anytime. Before my flight review, before a check ride, just before I go on a long flight, like tomorrow. If I really wanted to brush up on something, it's terrific. So thank you very much. You've both done a wonderful job. And I don't know if you can hear it, but I can hear the viewers applauding. Just for you two, though. Not for me, because I don't deserve it. Not even a little bit. Hey, thanks a lot. We will be back here Tuesday, June 22nd. Make sure you write in your questions for us for the special AirVenture show, because you don't know what's going to happen, and I'm not going to tell you. But write in ambassadors, plural, because there's 3 of us, at AOPA.org. Any topic you want. If it's an easy one, I'll take it. If it's hard, we'll give it to Kay, because she's smart. She used to fly a 747 sim. Woman's amazing. Hey, thanks a lot, folks. We really appreciate you being here. And like Kay said, keep flying, keep training, be better. We'll see you here next time. Bye-bye.
Good night, everybody.
Bye-bye.